The glamour of million-dollar hits stands in brutal contrast to a pool of blood on a Kingston street. In 1980, 24-year-old star General Echo fell under police gunfire. The case file was swiftly closed with a single line, "Suspect fired first." The music moguls instantly fell silent. Instead of demanding justice, they coldly accelerated the pressing plans to extract every last drop of profit from the dead man. Historical records suggest this fatal bullet arrived exactly as this human cash cow began to rebel, directly threatening the industry monopoly's absolute power. Was this truly a tragic act of self-defense or a perfectly executed purge? This bloody paradox holds the key to uncovering the dark truth behind how the music industry erased murdered dancehall star General Echo. The year 1980 was the bloodiest, most hyper-politicized era in Jamaica's modern history. Kingston was a city tearing itself apart in the crossfire of a brutal national election between Michael Manley's Democratic Socialists and Edward Sega's conservative forces. The streets were fractured into heavily armed garrison communities. Invisible borders, enforced by paramilitaries, dictated where you could walk, who you could speak to, and whether you survived the night. In this urban war zone, the neighborhood of Fletcher's Land was a harsh, unforgiving grid of cracked concrete, open gutters, and rusting zinc fences. Fletcher's Land functioned as a highly efficient production line for cheap, desperate human capital. When Earl Anthony Robinson came of age in these narrow alleys, the environment demanded total submission to its brutality. The local economy offered a binary choice for a young man lacking formal education and political connections. You either picked up a firearm to serve as a foot soldier for the local political dons, or you picked up a microphone to entertain them. Robinson chose the microphone, hoping the music would provide a shield against the stray bullets. He navigated the volatile eco-system of the street sound systems. The Jamaican sound system was a monolithic cultural and economic institution, far more than just collections of amplifiers and speakers stacked at a street corner. It was a mobile, heavily guarded, acoustic fortress that functioned simultaneously as a neighborhood's newspaper, its political rally point, and its underground banking network. The operators of these systems, the producers and the local enforcers, held absolute dictatorial authority over anyone who touched their equipment. Devoid of protective union contracts, human resources departments, or artistic development programs, vocalists were thrown directly to the crowd. Survival depended entirely on your ability to incite a visceral, immediate reaction from an exhausted, frustrated, and deeply aggressive audience. If the crowd lost interest, you were stripped of the microphone and cast back into the anonymity of the garrison. Robinson learned to read the underlying tension of the streets. He recognized that the audience craved extremity. He delivered it by pushing the lyrical boundaries further than anyone before him, utilizing shock value as a desperate survival mechanism. The street corner sound clashes were brutal, unsparing arenas. A young vocalist had to project absolute invulnerability. Showing hesitation or vulnerability meant instant career death. Robinson mastered the art of the boast. He developed a cadence that cut through the heavy, distorted bass frequencies and the ambient noise of a city constantly on the edge of a riot. He absorbed the violence of his surroundings and reflected it back to the crowd through his lyrics, realizing early on that aggression and vulgarity were the only currencies the streets truly respected. He forged an armor made of crude words and intimidating posturing. Up to this point, everything is still okay. He is merely a kid from Fletcher's Land trying to survive the night. He is hustling for small bills, gaining local notoriety, and so securing his physical safety by aligning himself with the powerful sound system operators. He feels a false sense of security, unaware that his vocal cords are about to be aggressively commodified by a corporate system far more lethal and far more calculating than the street gangs of Kingston. The transition from a neighborhood talent to a national commodity required a specific type of catalyst. The recording studios located in the safer, more affluent sectors of the city were watching the streets closely. The men who owned the mixing boards and the vinyl pressing plants were constantly scouting the garrisons for raw, exploitable material. They did not venture into Fletcher's Land out of a desire to uplift the impoverished youth. They ventured into the slums to mine for shock value. They needed a voice that resonated with the underclass, a voice that could be packaged, pressed onto plastic, and sold at a premium to a society addicted to the adrenaline of the ghetto. Robinson possessed that exact voice. He had the sharp intellect to string together complex, devastating rhymes and the street-level credibility to make them believable. But the industry executives were not interested in his intellect. They were interested in his desperation. They knew that a youth from the zinc fences would sign any contract, agree to any terms, and sing any lyric if it meant escaping the daily threat of political violence and starvation. They recognized his potential not as a human artist, but as a high-yield, low-maintenance, financial asset that could be squeezed for every drop of profit. The studio doors swung open, offering the illusion of wealth and the promise of island-wide fame. Robinson stepped into the vocal booths, leaving the immediate physical danger of the streets behind, completely oblivious to the exploitative industry machinery he was about to enter. The men behind the glass window handed him a microphone, dictating exactly how much of his own humanity he had to sacrifice to get paid. And this is where things really get dirty. The recording studio functioned purely as an industrial processing plant. When Earl Anthony Robinson stepped out of the suffocating heat of the Kingston streets and into the heavily air-conditioned vocal booths owned by the city's elite producers, he crossed an invisible, highly weaponized boundary. Behind the thick, soundproof glass sat men who viewed human vocal cords the way a refinery manager views crude oil. These were the architects of the Jamaican music monopoly. Men like Winston Riley and George Fong did not deal in emotions or cultural upliftment. They dealt in master tapes, international distribution rights, and raw, unregulated capitalism. To extract maximum profit from a deeply traumatized, politically fractured public, the executives required a new type of narcotic. The righteous spiritual consciousness of the 1970s, roots reggae era, was losing its commercial grip. The audience, exhausted by daily street warfare and economic stagnation, no longer wanted sermons about salvation or political unity. They demanded an escape. They demanded shock value. The producers recognized this shift in consumer appetite instantly. They needed a product that was abrasive, distracting, and completely devoid of moral boundaries. They needed a highly marketable filth, and they decided to manufacture it using the desperate youth of Fletcher's Land as their primary raw material. They looked at Earl Robinson and saw the perfect vessel. They systematically stripped away his nuance. They put him in front of a studio microphone and applied a very specific, ruthless psychological conditioning. They only handed him cash when he actively degraded himself. If the young vocalist attempted to sing about the harsh realities of the garrison or social upliftment, the studio engineers would abruptly stop the tape. The men behind the glass would shake their heads, withhold the session fee, and point to the door. But if he spun lyrics dead, ailing extreme hypersexuality, casual brutality, and the blatant objectification of women, the producer smiled, pressed record, and peeled a few low-denomination Jamaican dollars from a thick wad of cash. The issue isn't what he's saying. The issue is how the men in power explicitly monetized his degradation. They engineered the persona of ranking slackness, not as a natural artistic evolution, but as a highly calibrated, focus group-tested consumer product. They transformed a survival tactic into a commercial genre. Robinson was actively rewarded for being the most vulgar, the most aggressive, and the most terrifying voice on the microphone. The industry built a monster named General Echo, handed the grotesque costume to a vulnerable teenager, and commanded him to dance for his supper. During this intense period of fabrication, the public looked at General Echo and saw an apex predator. They saw a towering, untouchable figure wrapped in expensive, custom-tailored suits, dripping with heavy gold chains, projecting absolute sexual and physical dominance over the dance hall. But the private reality behind the studio doors was a stark, horrifying contradiction. Archival accounts paint a picture of a young man vibrating with severe nervous energy, the relentless chain smoking between takes, the constant paranoid scanning of the studio corridors, and the heavy perspiration that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He wore his arrogant dominance like a Kevlar vest, terrified that if he ever took it off for a single second, the executives would instantly replace him. He knew exactly how disposable he was. There were 100 other desperate, starving youths standing right outside the studio gates, ready to scream even louder obscenities into the microphone for half the price. He was performing his own dehumanization because it was the only currency the system accepted. And his fundamental flaw, his hamartia, was believing that if he played the role perfectly enough, the costume would eventually become real armor. He mistook his visibility for actual authority. He walked through the streets of Kingston and saw his name painted in massive crude lettering on the zinc fences. He heard his voice blasting from the towering speaker boxes of every passing sound system. He felt the sheer physical weight of the crowd's adoration when he touched the microphone. The roar of the audience convinced him that he held genuine leverage. He assumed that because he was the indisputable center of attention, he was also the center of the financial structure. He failed to realize that the men who truly controlled his destiny were completely invisible to the public, quietly sitting in secure offices, calculating the exact depreciation rate of his brand. The sheer depth of this exploitation lies within the specific architecture of Jamaican music production, the rhythm economy. In this system, the instrumental track is the only property that holds actual lasting value. A producer pays a band a flat fee to create a heavy, infectious bass line, copyrights that instrumental, and locks the master tape in a vault. The producer is the landowner. The vocalist is merely a tenant farmer, granted temporary permission to work the acoustic soil. The executives would bring Robinson in, play a backing track, and demand an instant improvised vocal performance. He would deliver his trademark slackness, secure a hit, and then be ushered out the back door with a handful of cash. The producer would then press thousands of vinyl records, collect the mechanical royalties, secure international licensing deals, and pocket the entirety of the long-term wealth. Robinson was generating millions of dollars in revenue for the labels, yet he did not own a single second of the audio he recorded. He was building an empire on rented land, entirely dependent on the fluctuating goodwill of men who viewed him with absolute sociopathic contempt. As his popularity surged to unprecedented heights, the workload became violently punishing. The industry demand for the slackness persona required a relentless, grueling schedule that no human body could sustain indefinitely. He was forced to constantly navigate between high-stress studio sessions and the volatile, dangerous environment of the street dances. The late nights, the constant exposure to the heavily militarized zones of the city, and the mandatory, aggressive hedonism expected of a dancehall king began to exact a heavy toll. He was existing in a perpetual state of adrenaline and paranoia, artificially sustained by the chemical stimulants casually provided by the studios to keep their assets awake and productive. He was burning the candle at both ends, entirely unaware that the men supplying the matches were already pricing out his replacement. The physical cracks in the armor were inevitably beginning to show, but the machine simply forced him to sing louder to drown out the sound of his own exhaustion. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, surrounded by a sycophantic entourage that fed off his temporary wealth and isolated from anyone who could offer genuine protection. He was a king of the streets, but a beggar in the boardroom. The contradiction was becoming economically unsustainable. He was fully aware that the massive crowds screaming his name were generating fortunes, yet his own pockets remained relatively light. The mathematics of his exploitation were becoming too glaring to ignore, even for a youth conditioned to accept the crumbs. The psychological pressure of maintaining the general echo persona, combined with the crushing realization of his financial powerlessness, pushed him to a breaking point. He was generating massive capital but lacked the legal infrastructure to protect himself, rapidly becoming a volatile liability to the men who controlled his contracts. But the plot twist is in 1980. The simmering tension between the exploited laborer and the capitalist owl nears required a specific catalyst to detonate. It required a piece of intellectual property so massive, so globally lucrative, that the sheer scale of the theft could no longer be hidden behind low denomination session fees. Up to this point, the executives had successfully managed his rebellion through intimidation and small cash payouts, but they were about to hand him an instrumental track that would change the trajectory of the entire industry, expose the darkest secrets of their financial ledgers, and ultimately sign his death warrant. The most lethal piece of intellectual property in Kingston during the early months of 1980 was a physical spool of magnetic audio tape carefully stored in the vaults of the Technique's record label. This tape contained an instrumental track known as the Stalag 17 Riddim. Originally composed and recorded in the early 1970s, it featured a heavy, suffocating bass line, a sharp militaristic drum pattern, and a menacing horn section that perfectly mirrored the paranoia of the Jamaican streets. The producer, Winston Riley, held absolute uncontested ownership of this acoustic real estate. Riley required a fresh vocal performance to resurrect the instrumental for the highly aggressive 1980 consumer market. He summoned Earl Anthony Robinson into the recording studio. The physical environment of these sessions perfectly encapsulated the power dynamic of the era. The producer sat safely behind a thick pane of soundproof glass, flanked by expensive imported mixing consoles, dictating terms in a climate-controlled room. On the other side of the glass, isolated in a cramped, heavily padded vocal booth, stood the 24-year-old vocalist. Robinson was sweating profusely, gripping the microphone stand with a desperate intensity. He knew he had a fleeting window of a few minutes to deliver a performance that would secure his immediate survival. He listened to the heavy, marching rhythm of Stalag 17 through his headphones. He reached into his May Intel archive of street observations and unleashed a completely improvised, highly controversial track. He recorded Arlene. The song was a masterpiece of the slackness genre. It bypassed all conventional radio censorship, detailing a predatory, dominant sexual conquest with unapologetic vulgarity. It perfectly matched the aggressive, unrelenting frequency of the bass line. Riley pressed the stop button on the tape machine. He recognized instantly that he had captured lightning in a bottle. The transaction was concluded in a matter of minutes. Robinson was handed a flat, unregulated session fee in depreciating Jamaican dollars, and he was dismissed back onto the dangerous streets of Fletcher's Land. Riley locked the master tape in his vault, securing the legal rights to an asset that would generate immense global wealth for the next 4 decades. The subsequent release of Arlene triggered a financial explosion. The demand was utterly unprecedented. The independent vinyl pressing plants scattered across the industrial zones of Kingston were forced to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just to meet the local street-level orders. But the true economic scale of the track quickly bypassed the shores of the island. Cargo planes were loaded with heavy boxes of 7-inch vinyl records, exporting the General Echo persona directly into the underground music markets of Brixton in London and Brooklyn in New York. The staggering magnitude of the theft committed against Earl Robinson lies hidden within the supply chain and the accounting mysteries of the dancehall underworld. Every time a record is manufactured and sold, it generates mechanical royalties. Every time that record is broadcast on a pirate radio station in the United Kingdom or played in a commercial club, it generates performance rights revenue. The international collection societies carefully tracked these plays, aggregated the foreign currency, and mailed the checks directly to the registered copyright holder. Earl Robinson's name appeared nowhere on those official registration forms. Legally, the Jamaican music industry categorized the most famous voice on the island as a mere session laborer, legally indistinguishable from a hired tambourine player. The producers absorbed 100% of the international back-end revenue. They hoarded the British pounds and United States dollars in secure offshore accounts, entirely insulated from the severe economic inflation that was destroying the purchasing power of the Jamaican working class. A glaring contradiction defined Robinson's existence during the absolute peak of the Arlene epidemic. If you walked the streets of Kingston in mid-1980, General Echo was undeniably the most famous man in the country. Throngs of desperate fans crowded him wherever he walked. He was forced to constantly project the aura of a wealthy, untouchable warlord. He wore the heavy gold chains and the tailored suits, successfully convincing the public that he was an apex predator. Yet, look closely at his underlying physical reality. He remained entirely vulnerable to the garrison violence. He possessed no private security detail. He still navigated the heavily armed political borders of the city, relying solely on his reputation. He carried thick wads of cash, but it was street money, volatile, dangerous, and constantly evaporating. Meanwhile, the executives who owned the rights to his vocal cords were silently relocating their families into heavily guarded, gated communities in the affluent hills of St. Andrew, purchasing imported Mercedes-Benz vehicles with the royalty checks generated by his vulgarity. The general could command thousands of sweating, aggressive bodies in a midnight dance hall, but he possessed zero legal authority to command a basic standard royalty contract in an air-conditioned office. Robinson possessed a sharp, analytical intellect beneath the street-hardened exterior. He began to observe the shipping manifests at the distribution warehouses. He saw the international chart placements and foreign music magazines smuggled onto the island. The terrifying gap between his massive cultural visibility and his empty bank accounts became impossible to ignore. The everyday personality, the vulnerable youth from Fletcher's Land, began to experience a profound, dangerous awakening. He realized that he was fueling $1 million engine, yet he was being compensated with the equivalent of spare change and free studio time. His fatal weakness, his hamartia, was the sudden arrogant assumption that his cultural value rendered him invincible against the corporate machinery. He believed that because the public worshiped the General Echo persona, the executives would be forced to respect Earl Anthony Robinson, the businessman. He decided to stop begging for marginal increases in his session fees. He decided to confront the entrenched power structure directly. He chose to stop acting as a highly profitable tenant farmer and attempt to buy the acoustic land himself. He initiated a strategy that terrified the label owners. He began hoarding his illicit street earnings. He stopped spending his cash on the fleeting hedonistic distractions of the dancehall lifestyle, and he started targeting the heavy hardware. He aimed to purchase his own towering speaker boxes, massive amplifiers, and custom turntables. He was preparing to build Echo-Tone hi-fi. By owning the physical means of distribution, he could bypass the producers, play his own exclusive recordings, and extract the entrance fees directly from the crowd. The industry executives watched this financial rebellion from their hilltop estates with cold, calculating silence. They recognized that a popular vocalist building a rival sound system was an act of economic treason. It was a hostile takeover initiated by a piece of disposable equipment. They knew the streets perfectly. They knew that an unprotected young man holding a massive concentration of physica, wealth in the middle of a political war zone, was a walking target. The sheer arrogance and immense physical danger of Earl Robinson's rebellion stemmed entirely from the specific anatomy of a 1980s Jamaican sound system. It was not a mere collection of audio equipment stacked in the corner of a club. It was acoustic, heavy artillery. Building Echo-Tone hi-fi required massive, custom-built wooden wardrobes housing 18-inch bass drivers designed to physically vibrate the internal organs of the audience. It required towering walls of mid-range horns, high-frequency tweeters, industrial-grade amplifiers, and miles of thick copper cabling. It required a dedicated crew and a heavy flatbed truck just to mobilize the operation across the city. This was not a hobby. This was heavy physical infrastructure. To the corporate executives holding his predatory recording contracts, Robinson was no longer just a disgruntled vocalist asking for a marginal increase in his session fees. By purchasing this equipment, he was actively constructing an independent economic state within their strictly controlled borders. A sound system functioned as a massive cash vacuum. When Echo-Tone hi-fi set up its towering speakers in a crowded dance hall, the revenue stream fundamentally reversed direction. The entrance fees collected in the dark at the corrugated iron gates, thick bags of untraceable Jamaican dollars, no longer flowed upward into the offshore bank accounts of the label owners. They went directly into the pockets of Earl Robinson and his immediate command structure, which included his trusted selector, Leon Big John Johns, and his logistical manager, Flux. Furthermore, by controlling the means of playback, Robinson could press his own exclusive dub plates. He no longer needed to feed the technique label's monopoly to hear his voice in the streets. He was systematically cutting the corporate umbilical cord, transforming himself from a leased asset into a direct competitor. His fatal weakness lay in a profound, catastrophic misunderstanding of his own power. He suffered from the deeply intoxicating delusion of the stage. When Robinson held the microphone, commanding thousands of sweating, aggressive bodies to move in perfect unison to the heavy bass lines, he felt completely invincible. He assumed that the intense loyalty of the dancehall audience translated into genuine political and physical protection. He believed that being General Echo, the reigning king of the island's music scene, made him untouchable to the police constabulary and the corporate dons. He failed to comprehend that, in the ruthless extractive geometry of Kingston's economy, the consumer does not protect the product. The crowd would scream his lyrics and dance to his music on a Friday night, but they would completely ignore his corpse on a Saturday morning, as long as the next sound system kept the bass line rolling. A dramatic contradiction marked his existence during the brief, high-stakes reign of echo tone hi-fi. He was projecting maximum dominance through his violent ranking slackness lyrics, yet he had never been more physically exposed. Operating a high-end sound system in the heavily militarized garrison communities required the logistical precision and armed security of a military convoy. The equipment was worth an absolute fortune, making it a highly visible, highly lucrative target for rival sound systems and armed political gangs desperate for capital. The established producers possessed deep, systemic ties to the police force and the neighborhood enforcers. They paid heavily for institutional protection. Robinson possessed none of this infrastructure. He was a rogue actor operating a highly profitable cash business in a war zone without a state sponsor. The men in the air-conditioned boardrooms did not panic publicly. They did not issue written threats or deploy legal teams to issue injunctions. They exercised their power through a calculated sociopathic silence. They watched him sink every dollar of his street capital into amplifiers and speakers. Knowing perfectly well the violent mathematics of the city, they knew that an unprotected young man holding a fortune in heavy hardware and cash on the volatile streets of Kingston was an equation that would inevitably balance itself in blood. The executives simply withdrew their invisible corporate umbrella and allowed the harsh ecosystem of the garrison to correct the anomaly. Consider the daily grinding reality of his new enterprise. Veteran operators from that era detailed the relentless extortion mechanics of the streets. A local enforcer would approach an independent sound system during a midnight dance, demanding a heavy percentage of the gate receipts simply for the privilege of operating in their political territory. If the producer was connected to the elite, the enforcer walked away. If the operator was independent like Robinson, the equipment was frequently destroyed or the crew was violently assaulted. Robinson was forced to constantly navigate this brutal extortion, bleeding cash to protect the very hardware that was supposed to guarantee his financial freedom. During this rebellion, the physical manifestations of his psychological state became impossible to hide. The arrogant, impenetrable mask of the ranking slackness persona began to fracture visibly. Studio engineers and associates noted his escalating paranoia. He was no longer just worrying about memorizing lyrics or maintaining his vocal stamina. He was burdened with the terrifying logistics of payroll, equipment security, and physical survival. The heavy gold chains he wore as trophies of his success started to look less like jewelry and more like a heavy, suffocating yoke. The extreme psychological stress of managing the echo tone hi-fi insurgency, combined with a relentless mandatory recording schedule demanded by the industry, began to drain his physical reserves at an alarming rate. He was existing on a razor's edge, fueled by adrenaline, chemical stimulants, and a desperate fear of sliding back into the poverty of Fletcher's land. He was pushing his physical limits to the absolute breaking point, utilizing every ounce of his intellect and energy to fight a two-front economic war against the studio monopoly and the street extortionists. But as he focused entirely on these external threats, a silent, far more lethal betrayal was occurring inside his own biology. The grueling, hypersexualized, chemically fueled lifestyle demanded by the industry was finally collecting its debt. This terrifying calculus locked directly onto Earl Anthony Robinson in the final weeks of November 1980. He was economically mutating into a massive threat by building the Echo Tone Hi-Fi sound system. He was actively disrupting the monopoly and attempting to steal the distribution network. But look closely at his erratic behavior during this exact period. Look at the frantic, desperate pace at which he was operating. He was recording at a frenetic, unsustainable speed, pushing his physical limits to the absolute brink, rushing to build his independent infrastructure as if he intuitively knew he was running out of time. Was General Echo beginning to feel the internal betrayals of severe physical burnout? The extreme mandated lifestyle was taking a visible toll that terrified him in the quiet moments away from the crowd. If his stamina was dropping, the producers noticed immediately. They were intimately aware of every drop of sweat and every skipped studio session, watching his physical reserves drain while he simultaneously attempted to hijack their revenue streams, sealed his fate instantly. He transitioned rapidly from a valuable commodity to a toxic liability that needed to be aggressively liquidated. He was a piece of decaying machinery that knew too much and demanded too large a share of the profits. The stage was perfectly set for a highly convenient tragedy. Robinson confidently believed his PR. Primary enemies were the rival sound systems jealous of his new equipment. He completely failed to realize that the men signing his checks viewed his very biological existence as a depreciating asset. That fatal miscalculation sealed his destiny on the night of November 22nd. The intersection of Slipe Road and Bowery Road was a heavily trafficked artery cutting through the heart of Kingston, tightly controlled by the state apparatus. When Robinson, along with his selector Leon Johns and stereo owner Flux, drove their vehicle toward that specific choke point, they were stepping into a highly efficient, state-sanctioned kill zone. A forensic examination of the physical evidence reveals that the official narrative provided by the Jamaican constabulary is a forensic impossibility. A police roadblock in Kingston during the violent climax of the 1980 national election was never a routine traffic stop. It was a paramilitary checkpoint. It was a mechanism of absolute spatial control designed to trap, interrogate, and neutralize targets. When Earl Anthony Robinson, his selector Leon Big John Johns, and his stereo owner Flux drove their vehicle toward that specific choke point, they were entering a highly coordinated tactical net. Observe the fatal weakness, the hamartia, of Earl Robinson operating in real time. He saw the uniforms and the barricades, yet he did not instruct his driver to evade the checkpoint. He remained entirely trapped in the delusion of his own celebrity. He believed the heavy gold chains resting on his chest and the sheer cultural weight of the General Echo persona granted him diplomatic immunity on the streets of his own city. He assumed the officers would recognize the most famous voice on the island, smile, and wave the vehicle through. He failed to comprehend that his political protection had been silently revoked by the corporate executives who previously sponsored his safety. He was no longer a protected cultural asset. He was an unprotected rogue operator carrying a highly valuable, potentially diseased brand. The vehicle came to a halt. The official police dispatch, obediently printed verbatim by the Daily Gleaner the following morning, established a narrative of self-defense. The authorities claimed the officers approached the vehicle, at which point the occupants suddenly drew weapons and initiated a heavy firefight. The police, acting entirely to protect their own lives, returned fire and neutralized all three suspects. The file was stamped resisting arrest and officially closed before the sun even rose. Subject this official narrative to the basic laws of physics and spatial geometry. A close-quarters shootout involving multiple firearms inside the confined cabin of a vehicle is an event of supreme uncontrollable chaos. Bullets ricochet off steel frames. Shattered safety glass becomes high-velocity shrapnel. The sheer kinetic energy of a multi-directional gunfight guarantees catastrophic collateral damage. If three desperate men open fire from inside a car at officers standing only feet away, the probability of the police walking away unscathed is statistically non-existent. Yet when the smoke cleared at the Slipe Road intersection, the physical reality presented a chilling contradiction. Earl Robinson, Leon Johns, and Flux were utterly decimated by gunfire. They were pronounced dead on the scene. But the police officers involved in this supposedly fierce, life-threatening firefight did not sustain a single scratch. There were no grazed limbs among the uniforms. There was no shattered glass embedded in their tactical gear. There were no officers rushed to the emergency ward. Independent researchers and historical investigators who later attempted to review the scant ballistic evidence noted a terrifying precision in the violence. The grouping of the fatal wounds on the victims did not reflect the erratic, panicked spray of a chaotic gun battle. The trajectories indicated sustained, highly accurate firing into a contained target area. It possessed all the clinical hallmarks of a summary execution. The occupants of the vehicle were not engaged in combat. They were systematically liquidated. The immediate aftermath of the shooting unfolded with the terrifying efficiency of a specialized corporate cleanup operation. Standard forensic protocols require securing the perimeter, preserving the vehicle for ballistic mapping, and rigorously interviewing every civilian in the vicinity. The Kingston Constabulary actively suppressed these protocols. The bullet-riddled vehicle was towed away with terrifying speed. The blood was washed from the asphalt. Witness testimonies from the surrounding neighborhood were aggressively ignored. Residents who heard the sequence of the gunfire, who noted the distinct lack of preliminary shouting, warning shots, or the chaotic cadence of a two-way firefight, found their accounts completely buried. The investigating authorities refused to document any statement that contradicted the predetermined narrative. The state apparatus moved with a synchronized mechanical efficiency to sanitize the street and finalize the paperwork. Why would the state police execute a popular musician with such brazen, unprotected violence? You must examine the political and economic alignment of 1980s Jamaica. The police force was deeply entangled with the elite power structures of the city. They protected the interests of the wealthy producers and the political dons who controlled the economy. The music executives did not need to hold a clandestine meeting in a smoke-filled room to explicitly hire a hitman. They simply needed to withdraw their financial and political shield from a highly visible target. In the corporate mathematics of 1980s Kingston, a state-issued bullet was the most cost-effective severance package available. The neutralization of General Echo served the music industry's strategic objectives with terrifying convenience. They instantly halted his attempt to buy LD Echotone Hi-Fi and hijack their distribution network. They permanently silenced a vocalist who was becoming increasingly aware of the massive financial theft occurring regarding his international royalties. The police force, hypervigilant and eager to assert dominance after the brutal national election, acted as the perfect, unwitting, or perhaps entirely complicit instrument of corporate restructuring. To those analyzing the aftermath, the event bore all the hallmarks of a flawless execution. The rogue artist, who tried to own his own labor, was gone. The loyal selector who controlled his turntables was gone. The logistics manager who owned the stereo equipment was gone. The entire infrastructure of the Echotone Hi-Fi insurgency was eradicated in a matter of seconds. The system demanded total uncompromising liquidation, and the police delivered it with absolute precision. The true horror of the General Echo assassination is found in the deafening silence that followed the gunfire. If a highly profitable chief executive is murdered in any legitimate industry, the corporate machinery roars into action. High-powered lawyers file immediate injunctions. Record labels demand federal investigations to protect their multi-million-dollar investments. Public relations firms launch massive campaigns demanding justice. When Earl Robinson was slaughtered, the Jamaican music industry did not release a single demand for an independent inquiry. Instead of launching private investigations or funding independent autopsies to challenge the absurd ballistics, the executives simply offered hollow, rehearsed condolences to the press and then completely turned their backs on the legal reality of the murder. Their absolute silence stemmed from profound sociopathic convenience. They accepted the heavily flawed police report without a single objection because the constabulary had just solved their greatest economic and public relations crisis. The label owners could throw their hands up in mock despair, blame the notoriously violent Kingston police force, and completely wash their hands of the blood. They possessed the perfect state-sponsored alibi. They observed the shattered glass on Slipe Road and saw only an optimized balance sheet. They realized that managing an artist's back catalog is infinitely easier and vastly more profitable than managing the artist himself. There are no royalty disputes with a corpse. There are no demands for better touring conditions or physical security. The trap had sprung perfectly, catching the vulnerable youth from Fletcher's Land exactly when he thought he was untouchable. The public believed they were mourning a tragic accidental casualty of the violent streets. They were entirely unaware that they were witnessing the successful conclusion of a highly coordinated medical and economic cover-up. The men in the boardroom had discovered the ultimate business model: total extraction of value, followed by violent state-assisted disposal. But the most damning piece of evidence was yet to surface. The detail that truly exposes the grotesque anatomy of this industry did not occur in the police station, nor did it happen at the crime scene. It occurred in the pressing plants and distribution warehouses the very next morning, before the bodies were even cold. The true measure of a corporate assassination is not found in how the target is eliminated, but in how rapidly the assets are liquidated immediately following the execution. The sheer, unadulterated horror of the Kingston music machine in late 1980 materialized away from the blood-stained intersection of Slipe Road, deep inside the heavily industrialized zones of the city. The true horror materialized in the deafening mechanical roar of the vinyl pressing plants. The transition from a triple homicide to a highly optimized retail event occurred with a speed that defies basic human decency. His corporate overseers treated the death of Earl Anthony Robinson as the Lonnie, of the most lucrative, perfectly timed marketing campaign in the history of Jamaican dancehall. The aftermath was a masterpiece of synchronized commercialism. Before the Kingston Constabulary had even filed the final paperwork claiming self-defense, the executives owning the Stalag 17 master tapes were already recalibrating the heavy steel presses. The machines ran 24 hours a day pressing Arlene and his other anthems, while the morgue was still processing the bodies. The elite producers did not freeze their bank accounts or halt distribution out of respect. They recognized a cold economic reality. A murdered, ranking slackness icon was the most valuable commodity on the global market. A living General Echo was a depreciating asset demanding independence and visibly crumbling under physical exhaustion. A dead General Echo was a permanently sanitized, highly profitable myth who could no longer demand an audit of the royalty ledgers. Within 48 hours of the execution, the street markets and retail record shops were flooded with his music. The producers weaponized the public's grief, explicitly monetizing the trauma of an entire generation. They transformed the tears of the Jamaican underclass into a massive influx of untraceable cash. This was accompanied by a profound sociopathic legal vacuum. When the island's top charting artist was gunned down, surrounded by blatant forensic impossibilities, the record labels did not file a single lawsuit for wrongful death or hire independent investigators. Their silence was absolute. They accepted the heavily flawed police report without objection because the state apparatus had permanently solved their greatest economic and public relations nightmare. The industry successfully buried the complex, terrified reality of Earl Anthony Robinson. They ensured that the public never saw the exhausted youth who was desperately trying to buy his own freedom from a predatory monopoly. They ensured the fans never said the potential physical deterioration that was silently threatening to destroy his marketable image. They replaced the human being with a two-dimensional, highly profitable caricature of a violent street warlord, permanently freezing him at the exact moment of his highest commercial viability. The total eradication of his legacy extended to the physical spoils of this execution, the heavy hardware he died trying to protect. Earl Robinson poured his entire underground fortune into the Echo Tone Hi-Fi sound system. He purchased massive, custom-built wooden speaker boxes, industrial-grade amplifiers, heavy copper cabling, and state-of-the-art turntables. This equipment was the physical manifestation of his rebellion. It was the heavily armed acoustic infrastructure that threatened the producer's monopoly and provoked the wrath of the system. When a street king is assassinated, his kingdom is immediately looted. The archival trail regarding the specific fate of the Echo Tone Hi-Fi equipment goes terrifyingly cold immediately following the Slipe Road massacre. The hardware did not go into a legally protected trust fund for his surviving family. It was not preserved in a cultural museum. According to the brutal, unwritten mechanics of the Kingston street economy, highly valuable, unprotected sound system hardware is instantly absorbed by the strongest surviving predators in the ecosystem. Rival sound systems, often financed by the very producers who wanted Robinson eliminated, swooped into the vacuum. The equipment was systematically scavenged. The heavy woofers were unscrewed from their custom cabinets. The amplifiers were stripped of their identifying marks. The thousands of feet of copper wire were repurposed. The very hardware Robinson purchased to secure his financial independence was dismantled, rebranded, and plugged directly back into the matrix of the monopoly. There is a sickening poetic cruelty to this ultimate act of corporate repossession. It is highly probable, based on the logistics of the era, that in the weeks following his execution, the bootleg tribute records, the exact records generating massive profits for the executives who silently approved of his death, were being blasted through the very speakers Earl Robinson had purchased with his own blood money. The system did not just take his biological life, they repossessed the physical instruments of his rebellion and turned them into their own public address system. They made him pay for the speakers that would ultimately broadcast the soundtrack of his own murder. While the equipment was being scavenged on the streets, an even larger theft was occurring in the international banking system through the foreign royalty streams generated by the posthumous sales explosion. When Arlene dominated the pirate radio stations in the United Kingdom, or when it was played in the massive commercial clubs of New York City, it generated consistent Performance Rights Society royalties. Under the draconian, unregulated contracts of the 1970s and early 1980s, the vocalist possessed zero legal standing. Robinson was legally categorized as a disposable session laborer. The publishing rights, the mechanical royalties, and the lucrative synchronization licenses belonged entirely to the producers holding the master tapes. After his death, there was no powerful estate capable of challenging this legal fiction in an international court. There was no team of forensic accountants fighting to audit the ledgers and secure a trust fund for his dependents in Fletcher's Land. The label executives simply absorbed 100% of the global back-end revenue. They funneled the British pounds and United States dollars into secure offshore accounts, entirely insulated from the severe economic inflation ravaging Jamaica. Earl Robinson's violent end had fertilized a money tree that his handlers would ruthlessly harvest for the next 40 years, completely unchallenged and permanently enriched by the Uichaizo blood spilled on Slipe Road. The execution of General Echo provided the industry with a flawless template. It proved that a highly profitable artist could be pushed to the absolute physical and psychological breaking point, extracted of all massive cultural value, and then swiftly liquidated the moment he became a financial or medical liability. The silence of the executives, the complicity of the police, and the frantic consumption by the grieving public locked this grotesque blueprint into place, setting the stage for the decades of disposable, blood-soaked entertainment that would soon follow. The immediate aftermath of the November 22nd execution did not merely result in a spike in record sales. It triggered a profound, suffocating psychological terror that blanketed the entire Kingston music scene. A chilling atmosphere descended inside the recording studios in the weeks following the massacre on Slipe Road. A silence of absolute paralyzed comprehension blanketed the scene. Every surviving artist, every selector, and every aspiring vocalist suddenly understood the true lethal parameters of the power dynamic they existed within. The glittering illusion of the untouchable street god was shattered overnight, replaced by the terrifying realization that they were entirely disposable. Earl Anthony Robinson was no longer just a murdered peer. He was patient zero of a new, highly optimized corporate disposal method. The surviving artist looked at the soaring sales of his posthumous records. They watched the producers, who had exploited him, counting massive stacks of untraceable foreign currency. They observed the complete lack of legal friction or police investigation. And in that cold, undeniable mathematics, they realized that their own deaths were highly lucrative financial models. They were walking around with massive bounties on their own heads, payable only to the men who owned their master tapes. If the reigning king of slackness, the most famous voice on the island, D, could be swatted like a fly and monetized the very next morning, what chance did a mid-tier artist have? This realization created a psychological prison for the performers of the 1980s. Observe the dramatic contradiction in the behavior of a typical dancehall artist during this era. On stage, they were forced to project maximum aggression, continuing to chant the hyper-violent, hyper-sexualized lyrics that the market demanded. They wore the heavy gold chains and the dark sunglasses, performing the invincibility of the garrison warlord. But off stage, they were sweating with paranoia. They knew they could no longer demand an audit of the royalty ledgers. They knew they could never attempt to build an independent sound system or bypass the established distribution networks. And most terrifyingly of all, they knew they could not afford to get sick. They had successfully decoupled the art from the humanity of the artist, proving that the most efficient way to manage a human resource is to completely remove the human. The true measure of this tragedy materialized in the sterile, climate-controlled boardrooms of overseas distribution hubs. As posthumous albums flooded the underground markets of London and New York, the international royalty architecture functioned as a masterpiece of legalized theft. Mechanical royalties and performance rights generated massive streams of British pounds and US dollars. Because Robinson was legally categorized as a disposable session laborer, this wealth completely bypassed his family in Fletcher's Land. The foreign capital was hoarded in offshore accounts by the very producers and international executives who had exploited him, insulated by geographical distance and willful blindness. The execution on Slipe Road transformed early, violent death from an unexpected tragedy into a standardized, highly lucrative career milestone. It sent a paralyzing message to the garrison communities. You are raw material, owned by the studio. If you accept the exploitation, you receive fleeting fame. If you rebel, you will be replaced, and the system will simply monetize the resulting grief. The industry proved it could seamlessly absorb the demise of its biggest star, face zero legal repercussions, and reap unparalleled international profits. This normalization of trauma became the unwritten, blood-stained constitution of the dancehall genre for decades to come. The narrative of General Echo is no longer a simple tragic biography. It is a comprehensive indictment of an entire global economic structure. The only task remaining is to deliver the final, inescapable verdict. When you stand at the intersection of Slipe Road and Bowery Road today, there is no physical evidence that a corporate assassination occurred on the asphalt beneath your feet. There is no brass plaque commemorating the exact coordinates where the Jamaican music industry perfected its most lethal management strategy. The heavy Kingston traffic flows seamlessly over the site, rubber tires erasing whatever microscopic traces of Earl Anthony Robinson, Leon Johns, and Flux might have survived the decades. The physical geography of the city has completely absorbed the violence, burying the massacre under layers of smog, commerce, and collective amnesia. The state apparatus and the corporate monopolies successfully scrubbed the crime scene clean in 1980, and time has finalized the erasure. Yet, the chilling paradox of this execution is that while his physical body was aggressively deleted from the earth, his digital ghost has been granted terrifying permanent immortality. Log on to any modern streaming platform. Search for General Echo. The algorithms immediately present the Stalag 17 rhythm in pristine, digitally remastered audio. You can track his monthly listeners across the globe. You can observe the exact data points of his posthumous consumption. The brutal machinery of extraction that originated in the claustrophobic recording booths of Kingston has seamlessly migrated into the servers of Silicon Valley. The men who orchestrated his exploitation did not lose their assets as the technology evolved. They simply transferred the blood-stained copyrights to massive multinational publishing conglomerates. The mechanical royalties that were once paid in physical Jamaican dollars are now fractionally calculated by sophisticated software, aggressively traded on international stock exchanges, and bundled into massive investment portfolios. Wall Street hedge funds now unknowingly generate quarterly dividends from the vocal cords of a desperate teenager who was gunned down in a slum because he dared to ask for the rights to his own voice. The laundering of the Slipe Road execution is absolute. The violence has been perfectly sanitized, transformed from a triple homicide into a clean, predictable line item on a corporate balance sheet. But the true cost of this highly optimized erasure extends far beyond stolen royalties. The industry's triad of silence inflicted devastating long-term biological collateral damage. The assassination of Earl Robinson did not merely establish a financial blueprint, it established a catastrophic public health mandate. By choosing to eliminate a potentially compromised artist rather than offering medical intervention, the music executives sent a lethal directive to the entire entertainment sector. The execution on Slipe Road established a catastrophic labor mandate. The culture of slackness, the hypersexualized, reckless lifestyle that Robinson was forced to pioneer, remained the mandatory marketing strategy for the genre. Because the industry had successfully covered up his severe physical deterioration in 1980 by hiding behind a fabricated police shootout, the subsequent generation of artists was forced to suffer the consequences of extreme exhaustion and chemical dependency and terrified secrecy. Seeking help meant instantly destroying their street credibility and triggering the termination of their contracts. This is the invisible generational trauma that permeates the foundational architecture of the genre. The system demanded complete psychological submission from its laborers, and it achieved it through the constant unspoken threat of violence and the aggressive denial of medical reality. The artists who survived the era did so by heavily censoring their own ambitions and brutally suppressing their own humanity. They learned to accept the predatory 360-degree contracts. They accepted the touring death marches. They accepted their status as highly profitable, highly disposable ammunition for the charts. The execution on Slipe Road served as an invisible permanent gun held to the temple of every vocalist who dared to step up to a microphone for the next 30 years, stripping away the mythological armor of the ranking slackness persona, reveals the terrified, exploited teenager trapped underneath. The studio bosses and political enforcers built a financial empire entirely on stolen labor and biological negligence, laundering a localized murder into a global institutionalized system of extraction. The narrative of General Echo forces the observer into a highly uncomfortable confrontation with the reality of modern consumerism. The listener is forced to acknowledge that the heavy, infectious bass lines that provide their escapism were directly funded by extreme human misery. The audio track cannot be separated from the blood on the asphalt. The art is inextricably bound to the atrocity. It is time to close the file on Earl Anthony Robinson and deliver the final, inescapable evaluation. He remains the tragic product of an unregulated economic system that viewed human beings purely as disposable capital. He was an impoverished youth with a brilliant mind, forced to weaponize his own degradation to survive, only to become a highly profitable commodity for men who viewed him with absolute contempt. His legacy is a massive, unpayable moral debt. It is a blistering Our maintenance invoice handed to a global entertainment structure that continues to view young, vulnerable talent as expendable cartridges of content. Every time a modern artist signs a predatory contract that strips them of their publishing rights, every time a young creator is pushed to physical and psychological collapse for the sake of touring revenue, and every time a label aggressively prioritizes a highly lucrative posthumous release over a living artist's rehabilitation, they are executing the exact corporate blueprint that was beta tested on General Echo. His legacy is the dark, foundational code of the disposable artist economy. If it weren't for the absolute institutional silence of the record executives, if the moguls had not realized that a perfectly timed bullet could permanently solve both a financial rebellion and a looming medical public relations catastrophe, the history of the music industry might have been forced to change course. If the public had demanded an independent autopsy on November 23, 1980, the cartel might have been shattered. The industry might have been forced to establish basic human protections. It might have been forced to openly acknowledge and treat the terrifying health crises ravaging its talent pool, potentially saving thousands of lives in the decades that followed. But the system did not reform. It optimized. The executives learned that a dead legend is infinitely cheaper to manage and vastly more profitable to exploit than a living, breathing, deteriorating human being. The vinyl record spins on the turntable. The digital streams multiply in the servers. The royalties accumulate endlessly in the offshore accounts. And the corporate machine simply waits, cold, patient, and perfectly calibrated, for the next desperate voice to step out of the slums and into the vocal booth.